Hello, and thanks for stopping by. I reckon it's time for another virtual pub crawl. The first instalment in this series, which I'll link below in case you missed it, has been really well received, and I'd like to raise a glass to all of you who left kind words and suggestions in the comments to that video. 2 pubs in particular stood out in those comments, and I've decided to include them here because they are indeed great choices. Of course, it goes without saying that if there are any more watering holes you'd like to propose for future episodes, please be sure to let me know, as I'd love to hear your ideas. Anyway, cheers and enjoy. The Prospect of Whitby was mentioned by quite a few of you in the previous video, so let's go and have a look. The pub's tucked away in the old and very atmospheric Docklands area, on a cobbled street known as Wapping Wall, which is a short walk from Wapping Station. As this tally of monarchs, which can be seen outside the pub listing every king and queen it's been open under, would attest, the Prospect of Whitby is very old indeed. I mean, look at that first name. This tavern was established during the reign of King Henry VIII. At first, and for many centuries, this pub was officially called the Pelican. However, thanks to its riverside location, this early establishment attracted a very dodgy clientele indeed, namely pirates, smugglers and other waterborne crooks. As such, locals came to refer to it as the Devil's Tavern. But don't let that put you off, things are now very civilised here. The Pelican name lives on, in the form of an alleyway known as Pelican Stairs, which runs alongside the pub and down towards the lapping waters of the River Thames. For several centuries, it was on this shoreline that Execution Dock, which was used to hang those who'd committed crimes at sea, was located. This grim location was very close to the pub, which is why you'll find this charming replica gallows displayed outside the back of the Prospect of Whitby. The tavern's proximity to the noose offered an excellent view of these maritime executions, and it's for this reason that Judge George Jeffreys, aka the Hanging Judge, was a regular spectator here. The tables would later turn on this tyrannical lawman, however, when he attempted to flee the country, but found himself apprehended by a mob outside the nearby town of Ramsgate pub, which, if you're keen to know more, is a tale I've covered in the previous instalment of this series. It was in the 18th century that the pub's name was changed to the Prospect of Whitby. This was a reference to a collier which used to transport coal from Newcastle upon Tyne to London. This hardy cargo vessel, which would often berth in Wapping, was named the Prospect and had been registered in, no prizes for guessing, Whitby. Back in the 17th century, before it changed its name, the pub was a favourite with the diarist Samuel Pepys, and due to its Thameside location, it's also been a popular spot for artists over the years. This view from the pub, for example, was painted in the 1860s by the American artist James Whistler, just a few years before he committed his mother to canvas. This artwork, meanwhile, was created by Charles Dickens in 1933, and this view by S.R. Badmin dates from 1937. There's plenty of examples in which the Prospect of Whitby can be seen on film too. This music video, for example, featuring Gilbert O'Sullivan, was made on location inside the pub in 1970. The historic tavern also has a brief cameo in the Only Fools and Horses episode, He Ain't Heavy, He's My Uncle, which was first broadcast in 1991. Right then, let's cross the river now with a quick train ride from Wapping to Rotherhithe, the route of which I'm sure you'll be interested to know takes us via the historic Thames Tunnel. Once outside the station, we'll turn left onto Railway Avenue, followed by another left onto Rotherhithe Street, and that will bring us to another picturesque Thameside pub, which, like the Prospect of Whitby, is also named after a notable ship. Dating from 1780, this delightful inn occupies the site of an even older pub that was called the Ship being spelt with 2 P's, that first started pouring beer way back in 1550. When the new tavern opened in 1780, it was named the Spread Eagle and Crown, but nowadays it's called the Mayflower. This title was chosen in 1957 when the pub was renovated following substantial war damage. Although this name change is relatively recent considering how long a tavern stood on this site, it does allude to an important historical link. You see, this part of Rotherhithe is very closely associated with the Mayflower, that eminent ship which carried the first pilgrims to America back in 1620. The pilgrims, who wished to settle in America in order to pursue religious freedom, converged on Rotherhithe in preparation for their voyage in the summer of 1620, and it was here they chartered the ship known as the Mayflower, the plan being that it would make the perilous Atlantic crossing alongside another vessel named the Speedwell, which had been secured in Holland. The Mayflower's captain was one Christopher Jones, a seasoned old sea dog who hailed from Harwich in Essex, but had been living in Rotherhithe since 1611. Like some kind of early 17th century Han Solo, he kept his trusty ship moored close to the pub, possibly to avoid paying taxes further along the river, and as such many of the Mayflower's crew, which has been estimated to have numbered between 30 to 50 hands, would have also hailed from this South London area. It's probably a safe bet then to assume that these sailors would have no doubt spent many a boozy night in what was then the Ship Tavern. The Mayflower set sail from Rotherhithe in July 1620 and sailed around to its first stop in Southampton, where it rendezvoused with the Speedwell, which had set out from Rotterdam. The small convoy then moved on to Dartmouth, but a series of ongoing structural difficulties rendered the Speedwell unfit for service, meaning the Mayflower had to make the perilous Atlantic crossing on its own, its final contact with English soil being Plymouth. As we know, the voyage was successful and Captain Jones returned the Mayflower to London, arriving back in Rotherhithe on the 5th of May 1621. Unfortunately, the American voyage had taken its toll on Jones and he died the following March. He's buried in the Church of St Mary the Virgin Rotherhithe, which stands right opposite the pub now named in honour of his iconic ship. You can see this memorial to Captain Christopher Jones in the grounds of St Mary's. It was sculpted by Jamie Sargent in 1995 and funded by the Sons and Daughters of the Pilgrim Society. Despite earning a place in the history books, the Mayflower ship was left to rot in Rotherhithe following Jones's death. Although it's said timbers from it were later salvaged and used to construct this barn in the historic Quaker village of Jordans, which is located west of London in Buckinghamshire. Although the Mayflower Barn, as it's called, was once a popular tourist attraction, please note it's now off limits to the public. As a quick side note, Jordan's also happens to be the final resting place of William Penn, the London-born Quaker who founded Pennsylvania. You can see his small gravestone outside the beautiful Jordan's Friends Meeting House, which is just a few minutes walk away from the Mayflower Barn. As a nod to its historic connections, one of the quirks of the Mayflower pub is that it was once licensed to sell American postage stamps. Although when I inquired at the bar if this was still the case, the staff didn't seem too sure.
Raise a glass, chaps. Add some friends. Add some friends. And the next round is on you, isn't it?
Ye Olde Cheshire Cheese is by far one of London's most famous pubs, and with good reason. It's accessed via one office court, which is off of Fleet Street. When you approach the pub from this alleyway, you can be forgiven for thinking that the building is going to be rather compact. However, once you step over this very well weathered entrance stone, take a moment to imagine just how many people have trodden across this over the centuries, and then venture within, you'll realise just how big the Old Cheshire Cheese really is. The interior twists and sprawls, with the corridor leading to both the restaurant and several bars. You'll find even more rooms downstairs, including this bar which fills so deep you could probably use it to sit out a nuclear war. If you do decide to venture down into the depths of the Old Cheshire Cheese, believe me, you really do need to watch your head on that staircase. I've lost count of the amount of times I've hit mine. There's been a pub on this site since the 1530s, meaning the original would have stood for over 130 years before it was razed to the ground in the Great Fire of London of 1666. As this iconic sign outside the pub famously attests, the tavern was quickly rebuilt in the aftermath of the blaze. Over the years, the Old Cheshire Cheese has become associated with a number of literary greats who enjoyed popping in for a snifter. These have included Mark Twain, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and of course Charles Dickens, who seemed to enjoy a pint wherever he went. We'll be seeing more of him, by the way, when we get to the next pub. Samuel Johnson is also said to have been a regular here, as the Old Cheshire Cheese would have been his local pub. You can still see and visit his house, which is just a few minutes walk away on Gough Square. It was here in the 1740s and 50s that Johnson compiled the very first English dictionary. Gough Square is also home to one of London's loveliest little statues, this being a small sculpture of Hodge, Johnson's much beloved pet cat. Samuel Johnson's association with the Old Cheshire Cheese is played upon in this 1920 advert for OK Sauce, as is this 1922 ad for Johnny Walker Whiskey. Sticking with literature, the Old Cheshire Cheese also makes an appearance in Agatha Christie's 1923 short story, The $1 Million Bond Robbery, in which Hercule Poirot is invited to sample the pub's steak and kidney pudding, which in those days was celebrated for its special ingredients, the contents of which included lark and oyster. Toasted cheese was another speciality during that era. Whilst we're on the subject of food, you might be interested to have a peek at this vintage menu from the Old Cheshire Cheese, which dates from the Second World War and features meals designed to accommodate rationing. Let's see what we have here. Marrow bones, tripe and onions, mushroom pudding. What would you have gone for? On a much naughtier note, it's believed part of this historic tavern served as a brothel during the 18th century. Evidence pointing to this comes from a collection of decorative wall tiles that were discovered in 1962 and feature some very rude scenes indeed. They're so blue in fact that I dare not show them here in full, although a quick search online will reveal them in all their full raunchy glory should your curiosity get the better of you. We can't leave the Old Cheshire Cheese without mentioning Polly. Polly, who was an African grey parrot and a resident of the pub in the late 19th and early 20th century, was apparently a very rude bird indeed, having mastered a catalogue of swear words, a skill he, or she, it's not really clear whether Polly was male or female, honed in World War I when the pub became popular with large groups of troops on leave. At the end of the Great War, in November 1918, Polly also learnt how to imitate the sound of multiple popping corks as people broke out the champagne to celebrate the armistice. A few years later, in 1921, the lucky parrots got to have a chat with Charlie Chaplin, who'd popped by to visit London, the place of his birth, in the wake of his rise to becoming the world's most famous film star. It was also reported that during his trip to the pub, Charlie Chaplin sampled the aforementioned toasted cheese. Sadly, in the autumn of 1926, Polly developed pneumonia, and despite valiant attempts to revive him with whiskey, he passed away at the grand old age of 40. Following his demise, Polly was promptly stuffed and stuck in a cabinet, and you can still see him inside the Old Cheshire Cheese today. You'll find him displayed behind the counter of the ground floor bar, which still has this archaic, and unsurprisingly, now redundant, Gentlemen only served in this bar sign above its entrance. Like the Prospect of Whitby, Dirty Dick's was suggested quite a few times in the comments of the previous episode of this series, so let's head on over there. The pub's on Bishopsgate, just across from the hustle and bustle of Liverpool Street Station. The first pub to occupy this site was established in 1745 and was originally called the Jerusalem Tavern, and it's quite a different name to its present title. So where does Dick fit into all this, and why was he so filthy? Well, the Dick in question was in fact a gentleman whose real name was Nathaniel Bentley. Nathaniel was born in London around the year 1735, and thanks to a successful ironmonger's business his father owned on Leadenhall Street, his family were very well off indeed. As such, Nathaniel was provided with the best schooling and indulged in the finest clothes. His sense of fashion no doubt inspired by his regular trips to Paris, where, on one occasion, he had the pleasure of being introduced to King Louis XV. This very swanky lifestyle reputedly led to Nathaniel being nicknamed the Beau of Leadenhall Street, which sounds a bit hoity-toity, doesn't it? But by all accounts, Nathaniel was in fact a polite, well-rounded and extremely amiable young man. At some point in his prime, Nathaniel met a woman with whom he fell deeply in love, and the pair became engaged. Sadly, the name of this mysterious fiancée has been lost to time, although the fate that befell her is known. Just a few hours before she was due to marry Nathaniel, she died suddenly. Following this devastating event, Nathaniel's mental well-being began to suffer dreadfully. His clothes became ragged and he abandoned any attempt at personal hygiene. "It's of no use," he was once quoted as saying. "If I wash my hands today, they'll be dirty again tomorrow." Although he'd inherited his father's wealth, Nathaniel's home, along with the ironmonger's shop and warehouse on Leadenhall Street, turned to squalor, and it was this sorry transformation that led to the former Beau of Leadenhall Street earning a new and unsympathetic nickname: Dirty Dick. Under the guise of Dirty Dick, Nathaniel Bentley became one of London's most noted eccentrics, and remained so for many years. He passed away in 1809, by which point he would have been aged around 74. Just a few years later, in 1814, the owner of the Jerusalem Tavern decided to cash in on the unfortunate legend of Dirty Dick by renaming their pub in his honour. This was a lot more than a simple name change though, it was a complete rebranding. Inside, the tavern was kitted out to look filthy and dishevelled, supposedly to recreate the look of Nathaniel's grubby home, and all manner of junk, including old pots and pans, cobwebs and even mummified cats were liberally spread around the joint. In short, the landlord of Dirty Dick's had created one of the world's first ever theme pubs. The gimmick paid off, making Dirty Dick's one of London's most famous drinking dens. Locals would often refer to it with the snappy shorthand DD, and I'm sure you won't be too surprised to hear that Charles Dickens was acquainted with both the pub and the tragic story that had inspired it. It's for this reason that Nathaniel Bentley is believed to have been the inspiration for the character of Miss Havisham, the bitter, ethereal-like woman who, in the 1861 novel Great Expectations, languishes in a decayed limbo after being jilted on her wedding day many years before. The building that's now home to Dirty Dick's dates from the late 19th century, and right up until the 1980s, its interior remained incredibly grotty. However, health and safety laws meant it eventually had to undergo a deep clean, a very deep clean I'd imagine, and the pub is now a much more sanitised affair. If you really want to, you can still see some of the old tat that was once spread around the pub, as various bits and bobs have been preserved and are now displayed in a very creepy cabinet located near the toilets. I won't show all of the items up close though, as some of them are genuinely grotesque and not for the faint of heart. pubs and quizzes go hand in hand. So here's a question for you. In what year do you think that this pub, the Carlton Tavern, which is on Carlton Vale, opened? The answer is 2021. Yep, despite looking very much like an early 20th century building, this pub, which backs onto Paddington Recreation Ground, is brand spanking new. Well, technically, and there's a story behind its present incarnation that is guaranteed to make your blood boil. Like other entries we've seen on this list, there's been a pub called the Carlton Tavern on this spot for many years. Some of the earliest references to it dates from around the turn of the 20th century, when it was home to the Carlton Music Society. The first Carlton Tavern was destroyed in the Great War during a German Gotha bomber raid. This attack, which took place in May 1918, also resulted in the tragic death of the landlord's 7-year-old son, Arthur George Stribling, who can just about be seen in the middle of this photograph taken outside the pub when he was a toddler. Following the havoc of World War I, the Carlton Tavern was rebuilt in a smart contemporary style, and the new establishment opened its doors in 1921. Its architect was Francis J. Potter, who was also known for designing the Hampstead Observatory, along with homes around the Hampstead Garden suburb. In the Second World War, the Carlton Tavern was one of the only buildings on Carlton Vale to survive the Blitz, and in the ensuing decades, it continued to serve the area as the surrounding bomb sites were replaced with blocks of flats. The old stalwart finally closed as a business in 2008. As the old pub lay empty, the surrounding area of Kilburn, like pretty much every other part of London, began to become a highly desirable area, meaning the property developers zeroed in. One such business, CLTX, obtained the old Carlton Tavern and drew up plans to convert the site into a block containing 10 apartments. At the same time though, the Carlton Tavern had come to the attention of Historic England. They'd noted the pub was, quote, remarkably well preserved externally and internally, and that few British pubs from the early 1920s had survived in such an unaltered state. As such, Historic England were poised to announce that the Carlton Tavern should be granted a Grade 2 protective listing. However, despite this, and the fact that CLTX had been denied planning permission for the proposed flats a few months before, the developers decided to blitz the pub with bulldozers in the Easter of 2015. The savage assault did not take long. On the 8th of April, the Carlton Tavern was unceremoniously smashed to the ground, complete with everything inside. This wanton act of destruction resulted in immediate outrage, and a campaign led by over 5,000 local residents was formed with the aim of getting Westminster Council to take action. One of the protesters was the actor Danny John Jules, who expressed his dismay in a BBC interview, noting how the pub had been in almost perfect condition when he'd walked past it just a few days before it was razed. If you'd like to hear Danny's thoughts on the matter, I'll leave a link to the interview in the description. Thanks to this passionate campaign, Westminster Council served an enforcement notice, which not only forbade CLTX from building their flats, but, in an unprecedented move, ordered the company to rebuild the Carlton Tavern brick by brick. CLTX appealed, but at the High Court, the Honourable Mrs Justice McGowan agreed with Westminster Council. Fair play to her, I say. Consequently, the developers, at great cost to themselves, reluctantly did as they were told. The task was carried out by BHD Architects and led by Jeff Haskins, who, with his team, used old photographs to help them piece the jigsaw back together. So then, this is the original Carlton Tavern. And this is the rebuilt version. A stunning job, I think you'll agree. Fortunately, the builders managed to salvage a number of features and materials from the rubble which have been incorporated into the rebuild. These include the original bar, parts of the ceiling, and apparently even the old scruffy toilet doors. The carbon copy Carlton Tavern reopened as a business in April 2021, exactly 100 years after its predecessor, and I'm delighted to report it now appears to be doing rather well. Considering it rose from the ashes of World War I, survived the Blitz, took on the developers, and relaunched itself in the midst of a global pandemic, I think it's safe to say that Kilburn's Carlton Tavern, just like countless other London pubs, is a survivor in the truest sense of the word. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this virtual pub crawl. I'd be intrigued to hear your own thoughts and experiences on the pubs featured here. Have you ever explored Dirty Dick's Cabinet of Curiosities? What do you think of the rebuilt Carlton Tavern? And had you been eating there in the 1940s, what would you have chosen from the old Cheshire Cheese's sparse wartime menu? As mentioned at the beginning of this video, please do let me know your own London pub recommendations, and you never know, they may appear in the next instalment. As always, I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to all of you who support this channel. Your kind words really do inspire me to keep making these videos. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, I'd be really grateful if you could please consider doing so, as this will ensure you don't miss out on any future content, as well as helping the channel to grow. Likes and shares are also very much appreciated. In the meantime, if you'd like more London related content, please be sure to head on over to my website, robslondon.com, where you'll find more history and trivia. I also have an Etsy store, Rob's Online Designs, where you'll find an array of London themed merchandise, including mugs featuring hand illustrated designs of tube trains, buses and taxis. Links are all in the description. For now, thanks again friends, stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.